Hi everybody, how are you? I hope you're well. Thank you so much for tuning in today. In this episode, I will first tell you about myself, then about the article I wrote for Big G's, and then lastly some takeaways from what I've learned in the process of writing this article and the research, and yeah. So let's get started. Okay. So I'm Sophie and I study international relations at King's College London. I'm originally from Germany, as you might be able to hear from my accent. So I grew up and I've lived all my life in Germany, and I grew up in a really small town close to Munich. If you know Munich, it's in the south of Germany. I went to an international school where I did the IB diploma. I don't know, maybe some of you are familiar with it. And for my final 2 years, so during the diploma years, I took global politics as one of my high-level subjects, and I also wrote my extended essay in global politics. So if you don't know what an extended essay is, it's kind of like a thesis, but just for high school instead of college. So I've always been very interested in politics and history and in generally what is happening around the world. So this is why it was pretty much an obvious choice for me to study international relations. So then in September I moved here to London to start uni, and so far I've really enjoyed my course, and I really took advantage of being able to attend as many society events like Diplomacy Society, Politics Society, UN Society, all of these societies' events, and to learn as much about the world as I can. And I've always had sort of a special interest in Latin America. So in my free time I would read a lot about the current political situation, the history of Latin American countries. And I took Spanish in high school, even though my Spanish is, let's not talk about it. And in uni then I would also go to a lot of talks that were specifically covering Latin American history or politics. And what I've noticed while reading or also while listening to talks was that there was very little coverage or media coverage in the news about Latin America's indigenous people. And I think that is sadly a phenomenon that we can observe in regards to most indigenous communities, so not just in Latin America, but also all around the world. And I think it's very upsetting that we omit indigenous peoples and their lives when we talk about countries and tell the stories of these countries. So when I found out about this journalism internship, I thought it would be the perfect opportunity to do something about it and shine some light on the situation that the indigenous communities face. And I decided to pick Colombia as my country to focus on in my article and for my research, because I already started studying Colombia and Colombia's history in high school, and since then I tried to keep very up to date with politics there. So it's kind of it's probably the country I know most about and I've read most about out of all the Latin American countries. So yeah, that is the basic gist of who I am and why I chose this particular topic. For the next part of the podcast, I would like to talk a little bit about the situation that indigenous and Afro-American communities in Colombia are facing, and also give you a bit of a background story on what is happening. So for a bit of a backstory, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or short FARC, and the National Liberation Army were both founded in the 1960s after a decade of political violence that swept across Latin America, which was known as La Violencia. However, the two groups were excluded from a power-sharing agreement that was reached after the fighting had ended. So many members of these groups were very frustrated, and they took up arms to fight against the government because they felt like they'd been done wrong and they felt like they should have been included. So both of these groups, even though their specific ideologies differ, oppose in generally the privatization of natural resources, and they generally both claim to represent the rural poor population against Colombia's wealthy elites. So sometimes these two groups work together, but sometimes they would also clash in certain territories. But I think these are like the two main groups, and especially FARC, that also my article focuses on. However, then in 2012, after decades of conflict, the Colombian president started a formal peace talk with FARC, and this peace agreement basically called for FARC members to hand over their arms to a UN mission, and in return the government pledged to spend billions of dollars in rural areas, which many say have been historically neglected by the government. And in 2016, finally, the two sides reached a ceasefire, and the president and FARC leaders signed a peace treaty. Okay, and like I said, the peace treaty really aimed to improve living conditions of the Colombian people. So much about the backstory of the conflict. I went into a little bit more detail here in the podcast now than in my article, because in my article I really wanted to focus on the specific human needs challenges that indigenous and Afro-American communities are facing in Colombia, but I thought maybe for the podcast it would be nice to get more of a general overview of the conflict's history. So now let's briefly look at all the challenges that many indigenous and Afro-American communities in Colombia are still facing despite the signing of the peace treaty, right? So, like I've just mentioned, Colombia's rural areas, this is where most of the indigenous communities live, have historically been underfunded and neglected by the government. And even though the peace treaty promised greater attention to these areas and increasing spending in these areas, implementation has been very slow, which has hindered and limited a lot of the progress that could have been made since the signing of the peace treaty. So hence many challenges still persist in these areas, and indigenous and Afro-American communities still face considerable violence by armed guerrilla groups, such as killings and kidnappings, and also forced recruitment to these groups. And as these communities often live in very resource-rich lands, armed forces regularly try to expel them from their land to gain access to these natural resources. And unfortunately, the government has been has not properly upheld indigenous communities' land rights, which means it's very easy for these armed groups to then expel and displace indigenous and Afro-American communities from their land. And then the extraction of these natural resources has also led to considerable environmental damage and degradation to their territories. And like I've already said, these communities are often severely underfunded, with little access to government services or high-quality education. So they also face extremely difficult economic situations, but also social situations. And because they lack proper political representation and have historically lacked proper political representations, many of their issues and the challenges they face don't get properly addressed in government, because there's nobody that truly... there are very little people that care about their specific needs, because of this political underrepresentation in government. I go into much more detail about these topics in my article, so maybe make sure to check it out after the podcast if you're interested to read a little bit more. But this is these are the main challenges and issues that these indigenous and Afro-American communities in Colombia are facing. So what is really important for me, and what I hope this podcast and the article and also then the infographic will do, is bring attention to the issues that indigenous and Afro-American communities, and in particular now Colombian indigenous communities, have to deal with. I would hope that my work has gotten you curious about the situation, and that you will maybe do some research by yourself, or at least check out the article and maybe even share it if you like, so that we together can maybe bring more attention to these problems and give indigenous communities the kind of consideration and attention that they deserve and that they've been lacking for far too long. And this brings us to the end of my podcast. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something, hopefully. And like I said, I would very much appreciate it if you read through the article itself and maybe share it with your friends if you think they might be interested, or if you found it interesting. And thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.